Before we begin again, let's take a moment to remember our marhumin, the marhumin in our community, and all those who are in need of dua with one surah Fatiha, with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تحسبن الذين قتلوا في سبيل الله أمواتا بل أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وعلى صل على محمد. Your second salawat for love of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa. And your loudest salawat for ta'ajil faraj sahib al-asr wa zaman. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بذكر المسائب آل محمد. May Allah increase in our reward for commemorating the difficulties of Ahlul Bayt. We've been having this series of discussions around 12 questions pertaining to the event of Karbala with the interest of explaining some matters that typically don't have the opportunity to go into discussion in depth around. Again, what's interesting is that these questions that I've shared with you that we've asked and we've been talking about, these 8 questions and the 4 for today, we've presented one perspective of how to answer these questions, but there are actually different opinions and more in-depth explanations. To the extent where these 12 questions, we could spend 12 nights discussing each of these questions, presenting different perspectives. The goal here was not to give you an exhaustive answer, right? The point that I had when I started this conversation with you was not to give you every possible solution that exists, but rather to teach you there's so much more to the history, philosophy, importance of Karbala than simply what the pulpit can give you. This pulpit is an introduction. Remember something, the pulpit is designed to communicate with everybody from the ages of childhood to the ages of adulthood. So the conversation that comes from the pulpit is always going to be something that is a very balanced and, for lack of a better term, mediocre conversation that hits all age groups to keep our community moving together. The minbar is not the only tool that we have about the education of Islam. The minbar is the community's tool to keep our community moving in one direction together, so that we're on one page, one pace. We understand a medium that everybody can understand and agree with. Me as an individual, I have a responsibility to add to my knowledge and add to my research, and the pulpit introduces me to things that I can learn about. So our goal, again, is not an exhaustive conversation, but an introductory conversation to open your thoughts, open your mind to different ways of looking at the same event in history. I may have been hearing about Karbala all my life, and maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years now I've been listening to this story. That doesn't mean I know everything about it. There's a very deep conversation that has to exist. And part of this is our responsibility. A few years ago, I went to go recite in a city, we won't mention which one, but it wasn't this one. They have a team called the Astros, but that's all I'll tell you about it. And I was literally reading the Maqtal of Imam Hussain. And in literally reading the Maqtal of Imam Hussain, there's a moment where the Imam goes and he takes water and he's about to drink the water. And the army of Umar Asad calls out, "Oh Hussein, you drink water while your women are being looted." And Imam Hussein throws the water away and he goes to save and protect his camp. There was a gentleman there who must have been at least 60 years or older, who after the Majlis, the day of Ashura, accosted me and he yelled at me and he said, "How dare you? How dare you imply that the Imam tried to drink water?" And I became quite confused. And I asked him, I said, okay, this is the book that I took reference from. This is the other books that say it. Here's 2 other 3. Which source are you quoting that says that this is inappropriate? He says, I don't need a source. I've been listening to majlises for over 50 years of my life. And that's it. That was his argument against me, that for 50 years, in the language that he was familiar with, he heard a majlis, and because they always said the same thing in that majlis, that must mean that's the only truth that exists. And he actually started berating me in the middle of, on the day of Ashura. And the other Maulana came, and the other Maulana spoke his language and kind of told him to calm down, back off, and explained everything to him that was going on. But the gentleman wouldn't take it because he says, for 60 years, no one said this to me, and all of a sudden now this person is going to say it to me. He had no proof. So what happened? What was the mistake there? The mistake there was what? Was that he had never invested any of his energy more than the majlis to learn about, to think about, to study what happened in Karbala. And as a consequence, even though he's a grown, mature man, considered to be an elder, he doesn't know enough about the event to be able to hear what actually happened in Karbala. Now apply that to a contemporary conversation, right? Let's take a look at why this is important. Let's say the only knowledge I have about the Imam of my time, Sahib al-Asr wa zaman, ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-sharif, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, is what I've heard. And that's it. The pulpit can only talk about so many things. In 40 minutes, I can't give you the world of information. Even now, to do a 40-minute lecture, it takes 8 hours, 10 hours, sometimes weeks, sometimes months to understand how to present the content. But let's say the only thing I know about my Imam of my time is what I've heard from the pulpit. When the Imam comes and does something that I disagree with, what's going to happen? Am I going to follow that Imam? People didn't in history. When Imam Hussain alayhi salam went and he gave up the Khilafat, and he gave it to Muawiyah, and he says, this is not important, it's more important to save the Muslimin. The people of the time used to insult the Imam. They had the Imam in front of them. They could see the Imam. They could spend time with the Imam, but they didn't understand what the Imam should do because they had never learned about what an Imam is. The same thing, we imagine we're going to see our Imam and all of a sudden we're going to be perfect. We're going to be the best people ever. Well, guess what? The people in Karbala could see Imam Hussain in front of them. They saw Ali Akbar in front of them. But what happened? They didn't know enough about the subject. They didn't know enough about the Imam. They didn't know enough about their obligation to Ahlul Bayt to be able to follow them. And the same frightening thing is true about us. The point of this conversation is to show us how much we have to study and learn so that we don't make the same mistakes as those nations before us. And when it comes to the Imam of our time, when it comes to understanding and appreciating Ahlul Bayt, we don't become people who are ignorant of reality and only what we hear from the pulpit is all we know, and if the pulpit didn't tell us, then it must not exist. It's a scary reality. That means that we're being lazy in our responsibility. We have more to do. We have work to do. So as such, there are still 4 questions to cover today by the barakat of the day of Arba'in. We'll mention 4 of these questions with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The first of these questions, why do we mourn for Imam Hussain? This question comes from the idea that there's a debate and discussion that says that if we claim that Imam Hussain had a victory, why are we crying? He won. He accomplished his goal. His message survived. Rather, there's a debate and discussion that even says, and it's a semantic debate, it's not a legitimate debate, but the semantic debate points to and says that why shouldn't we cry over the other Ahlul Bayt who were assassinated and killed in injustice? More significantly than anyone, our 7th Imam. Imam Musa Kazim spent over 14 years in prison. If you were to look at those prison cells, they were such a condition that the Imam could neither stand up straight nor lie down flat. And some of these prison cells would be in the basement or in the well of the basement of the prison. So imagine the basement is the basement, but in the basement is a well, and inside of the well is the prison of the Imam. But overwhelmingly and collectively, we're mourning for Imam Hussain. Even to the extent, you take a look at the example of the seventh Imam, Imam Raza. Imam Raza doesn't teach us to cry for Imam Musa Qasim. Imam Raza teaches us to cry for Imam Hussain. So one reason why we cry for Imam Hussain is that the Ahlul Bayt taught us that this is the place to focus your huzn, to focus your sadness on this event, to keep this event alive and to make it a cornerstone of your life. There's more to it. To understand more to this, we have to look at the nature of a human being. The nature of a human being is that we are a physical body and a spirit. And our spirit and our body work together to keep us alive. Scientifically speaking, a dead human being and that human being when they're alive, there is no physical difference except that one can move, one can't. They weigh the same, they look the same, they have the same features. One is alive, one is dead. The object that keeps us alive is that soul being attached to our body. That soul is a very important element in terms of who we are as a human being. Right now, if you're listening to me, you hear with your ears. What is hearing me? You're seeing me with your eyes. You're thinking about what I'm saying with your brain. What is the you? That you is your spirit. That you is your essence. That uses this body as a tool. Now what happens to a human being is sometimes, and not sometimes, always, there's a conflict between the body and the soul. There are the needs of the body and there are the needs of the soul. And because the body is physically present in front of us, as human beings, we have a desire to focus more on the needs of the body and ignore the soul. And these two work together. And there's an entire discussion that we can have about this, but essentially as these two work together, most human beings, especially in the Western society we live in, we're very material focused, we're very body focused. We want to see results, we want to be able to touch results, we want to be able to be impacted by those results, and as a consequence, our culture is one of materialism that ignores spirituality. There's no system of training or taking care of your soul. But the soul is very important. That's what Allah wants us to purify. That's what Allah wants us to work on. That's what all of these ibadat are for, to help bring our soul to life. That's what the recitation of Quran is for. That's what the fasting in Ramadan is for. That's what the salat and tahajjud and all these amal are, so that your soul is active and present in your body. And that you are cognizant, aware of your soul, and you work with your soul. Your soul works with you all the time. There are certain conditions that are physical conditions and other conditions which are spiritual conditions. Happiness is a spiritual condition. Why? Because when I'm happy, I may physically manifest the attribute of happiness differently. Some people may laugh when they're happy. Some people may get excited when they're happy. Some people may be quiet when they're happy. And we don't know what it is until the person tells me and says that, oh, I'm behaving this way because I'm happy. Same thing with fear. Every person is afraid in a different way. That tells us that fear, the actual condition of fear, is a spiritual condition that we see physically in different ways. The same way, for example, there are certain physical conditions that manifest on our spirit. When I'm sick, my body is sick, but I feel emotionally down. I feel drained. I'm not as happy. I'm not as active. Why? Because my body, as it suffers, it affects my spirit. These conditions of bouncing back and forth, they're always in a process of one dominating the other. That sometimes the body is dominating, sometimes the soul is dominating, but more often than not, humanity in the absence of religion, or even with the presence of religion, has a tendency to lean towards the physical and ignore the spiritual. To reignite the spiritual, Allah gave us the month of Ramadan, that for 30 days, ignore the body. Don't eat, don't drink, don't do any of the things that have physical pleasure associated with them or satisfaction, so that you become more aware of your spirit. Which is why in the month of Ramadan, suddenly you feel like, I feel like praying. I feel like, maybe I can recite some Quran, I can do some good. Why? Because we starve the body to feed the soul. Allah gave us another tool to wake up this soul. And that tool to wake up this soul is the mourning for Imam Hussain, is the grief for Imam Hussain. The reason that all of the Ahlul Bayt taught us to cry for Imam Hussain and insisted upon it. Didn't just say cry, no, they insisted. And they insisted on the benefits of it. When we see, for example, our sixth Imam Jaffari ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, explaining and saying that if you make 100 people cry, I promise you that it will be an intercession for you to go to heaven. 90 people, 80 people, 5 people, 4 people. You only make yourself cry. It will be an intercession that will help you go to heaven. The Imam goes even further. Forget legitimately crying. If you fake cry a tear the size of the wing of a fly, it will help you get into heaven. The significance of what the Imam is telling us is that this crying for Imam Hussain awakens your soul. It brings you back to life. It brings you connected back to the path of Allah. The soul is something that constantly in this battle between the body and the spirit is always on the weaker end. And we know this because there are certain attributes that have been told to us about when your soul doesn't work right. Imam Ali has a statement where he makes and he explains, he says, tears do not dry up except for the hardening of hearts, and hearts do not harden except for the excessiveness of sins. Crying is something matloob, is desired even in your salat, when you go at night to pray. When you pray, when you do dua in front of Allah, you want your dua to be accepted, cry in front of Allah. Have you ever found it? You can't cry in front of Allah. You can't cry when you're asking and speaking to Allah. It's because things have rusted our heart. These actions and these sins that we commit have prevented our soul from being able to manifest itself in our communication with Allah. The masa'ib of Imam Hussain cut through the rust. Better than WD-40. Well, WD-40 is good, but better than that WD-40 is the crying for Imam Hussain. That it cuts through those sins and brings the spirit back to life and remanifests it. Think of any moment when you're crying for Imam Hussain, when tears and sorrow come to your eyes for the Imam. Think about who you are in that moment. In that moment, you would do anything for the Imam to accept you. You would change and you want to change and be exactly who the Imam wants. In that moment when your heart opens up to about Abdullah, to the masa'ib of Imam Hussain and his family, you don't want to be who you are. You want to be who the Imam wants you to be. You want to be the helper of the Imam. In that moment, if you are asked, do you want to change? Do you want to be better? There's no person alive who would say, no, I'm okay. They would say, no, my Imam suffered like this. If I could be someone who could be with him, what would be better than that in my existence? That revolution in the heart is why we cry for Imam Hussain. Because at the end of that majlis, at the end of those tears and that sadness, you've reawoken your spirit. And that's it. This is a season of awakening the spirit again. That bringing that spirit back to the surface. It's not just in the month of Ramadan. In the month of Ramadan, there's a different tool that wakes us up. In the month of Muharram and Safar, it's the sadness for Imam Hussain. That spiritual reaction. Which is why the Ahlul Bayt always promoted crying for Imam Hussain. You see Imam Raza cry. You see Imam Jawad cry. You see Imam Sadiq cry. You see Imam Zain al-Abidin cry. You see Imam Ali cry for the masa'ib of Imam Hussain. You see Imam Hassan cry for the masa'ib of Imam Hussain. You see Bibi Fatima cry for the masa'ib of Imam. You see the Holy Prophet cry for the masa'ib of Imam Hussain. It's a lesson to us that this is a wasila, this is a connection by which it awakens your spirit again and brings you back to the path of Ahlul Bayt. So which is why, when you sit in a majlis, these masa'ib are not a little matter. The intellectual debate and discussion opens my mind. The masa'ib opens my spirit and my heart. And we need that. And you can see it, that after I've cried for Imam Hussain, I want to be a better person. I don't want to be the same person I was before. We need that experience, which is why bring yourself to that point. And one of the ways that we do that is we learn about the masa'ib of Imam Hussain. We learn about the difficulties of Imam Hussain such that it makes us cry, such that it attaches us to him, and make the environment of crying, right? You want to teach your children how to be connected to Imam Hussain, you have to do it yourself. Sit your children in front of you. If they don't see you cry, they're not going to cry. This society that we live in, the culture that we live in, both for boys and girls, not one or the other, both for boys and girls, sees crying as a weakness. It sees it as a negative quality. It's seen as a bad behavior. If you want to teach your child that crying for Imam Hussain is different than crying for anything else, they have to see you. They have to be part of that experience. They have to sit with you to see that if my father does this, if my uncles do this, if my brothers do this, if my mom does this, if my aunts do this, then this is something I should be doing too. It does have a culture that it needs an education for, and it does take something that we have to invest in. It won't happen. It can happen automatically, but same thing. Will a child pray for their entire life on their own? Maybe. But better chance for that child to pray all their life is what? That I pray in front of them and I teach them to pray. The same is the concept for all of the Islamic ethics. The nature of human beings is to lean towards Islamic ethics, but the benefit should be that if our families are Muslimin, that Islam should be easier for us to adopt and implement in our lives. Which brings us to our second question. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. How should we mourn for Imam Hussain? This is a fun question. There's all of these debates about what's right and what's wrong with mourning for Imam Hussain. Can we use chains? Can we use blades? Can we do tatbir? Can we do matam? Is matam inhumane? Isn't it hurting yourself? All of these questions that come up are in a way trying to compromise the idea that the mourning for Imam Hussain should have an impact on me. Similarly, for example, vegans have an argument that says that it's inhumane to kill animals, so we shouldn't eat them. Not necessarily. What's inhumane is you can't stand the aspect of looking at it, that's why you don't want anyone to do it. In the same concept, those who preach against the idea of azab for Imam Hussain many times say, no, it makes me uncomfortable. What does it have to do with you? If you don't like it, don't do it. The mourning for Imam Hussain can and does take many different aspects. This latam or matam that we do actually has a history that it was done, for example, in some narrations that Rasulullah invited the women to do this for his uncle Hazrat Hamza. That matam was done for the Holy Prophet when he became martyred as well too. It's not something we came up with. The purpose of this matam was that it was a communal action of mourning. You see, mourning by itself, a person who is sad, is individually sad. My grief, I can't express it in front of others in its entirety. And each individual goes through this and deals with this process of mourning and grief individually. This action became a collective by which people going through an individual experience made a communal experience of mourning and expressing their grief and sadness. So that the community entirely together could be in the same level and understanding of the sorrow that they were experiencing. Each culture has taken this expression of grief and personalized it. How, for example, we do in India and Pakistan is different than people in Afghanistan, different people in Iraq, different than people in Iran, different now in America, even as the culture is being established of how mourning will be done in this culture. But the collective aspect of mourning takes people individually going through an experience and gives them an outlet to unify and create a community of shared experience. And that's a good thing, that we share this experience of mourning and sorrow for Imam Hussain. And that we can collectively, if I have sadness, I have a way of expressing it. Now when it comes to, for example, things like zanjir, and it comes to things like, for example, tatbir, there's an argument that says, oh, it's self-harm. Hang on a second here. The harm that's forbidden in Islam is from the Quran, where Allah says, وَلَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ, and do not cast yourselves by your own hands into perdition. Meaning no human being has the right to perform an action that brings him to death immediately. If, for example, I know that jumping out of a plane without a parachute is going to kill me, That's haram. But the idea that, for example, I can have high blood pressure and then still eat a burger, does that burger kill me? No, it may be harmful to me, but it's not haram. In the same context, no one who does these actions of zanjir or tatbir is trying to kill themselves. They're not, and nor do they believe that they would die by doing this action. They have the right to choose an action that they perform, and the action within itself is mubah. The same way the argument comes that it wasn't done in the time of the Prophet, fair. It wasn't. Wasn't done in the time of the Ahlul Bayt, wasn't. Neither was driving. Neither were donuts or pizza. Didn't exist. So what, should we take everything that didn't exist at the time of the Prophet and throw it out? No. Humanity has the right and discretion that as the environment and the culture changes and our expressions change in a time, that we have the right and the permission to utilize the expressions of the time. There's nothing wrong with it. The intention is not to cause an individual harm. The intention is it's an expression of mourning and grief. And even the person who participates has no expectation that I'm going to die in this event, nor do they intend to, nor do they hope to, nor do they expect to, or nor is it normal that that should be seen. So to say that the action itself is haram, no. Do I have to do it? No. One of the great things about being a follower of the Ahlul Bayt is the respect for a mu'min. The respect for a mu'min, not mu'min, mu'min too, but mu'min. I have to remember where I am and who I'm talking to every now and then. Is that I give the mu'min the right to have an opinion and to express himself. My grief may have a different way of being expressed. It makes it no less valid than the person next to me who expresses his grief. And part of these expressions of grief is how I want to be able to attach myself to the cause of the Imam. And that's what the intention is. We don't, for example, go out and do matam when my car gets totaled. We don't go out and do matam, for example, when I lose money in the stock market. When do we do it? For grief of Ahlul Bayt, to attach to the message of Imam Hussain. There's a particular place and environment where this is appropriate. And as long as it remains within that environment, it brings my community together and it's something useful. Each of us will have the right and has the right to express that grief individually. Why should I be the gatekeeper that prevents somebody else from feeling sorrow and expressing their sorrow for the Imam? Who gave me that responsibility? Who said that's the right thing to do? I can disagree. I can express my grief the way I feel it, and my brother can stand next to me and express his grief differently. Does that make him wrong? No. As long as the intention is to attain proximity, to express my sorrow and mourning for the Ahlul Bayt, it is something that is desired that we do. To promote these things is a good thing. To be attached to the expressions of mourning, that when I'm individually feeling grief, that if all of us feel the same grief together, we feel the same sorrow together, we feel the same pain for Ahlul Bayt together, maybe through that communal expression, it'll increase my love for Ahlul Bayt. It'll increase my attachment for my brothers who are with me. It'll increase my attachment to this community. Why do we have to stop this? As long as the intention is correct, the action is fine. It's permissible. On to our third question of the night. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. What is the significance of Arba'in? And why do we commemorate Arba'in of Imam Hussain? And we don't for anyone else. There's no Arba'in, for example, of Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam Zain al-Abidin. There isn't. There are a few different ways of analyzing this question. But to put it simply, the waqia of Karbala was something that the Ahlul Bayt wanted to persist in the example of Islam and Muslimin. That this example lives on. And which is why we see the hadith from our 11th Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. Alamat al-mu'min khamsa. That the signs of a mu'min are 5. He recites 51 rakat of salat a day. He prays, and when he prays, he puts his head on turba. He is someone who recites Bismillah out loud. You find a ring in his right hand, and he performs the ziyarat of Arba'in. Now, what's interesting and why this hadith is very particular to this point and why I'm saying that Ahlul Bayt wanted this example to remain in society is that these examples and signs of a mu'min are very different than the signs of a mu'min that Imam Ali describes, that Imam Hassan describes, that Imam Zain al-Abidin describes. All of their signs of a mu'min have to do with the relationship between man and Allah. The signs that Imam Askari describes are very physical. The explanation is that Imam Hassan al-Askari, when he gives these 5 signs, says Bismillah out loud when he prays 51 rakats, prays on turba, wears a ring, does ziyarat of arba'in, are the physical signs of how you can recognize a mu'min in society. When the Imam says, Alamat al-mu'min khamsa, the signs of a mu'min are 5, it's that when you go out into society and you need to figure out who's one of my people, who's my people, look for these 5 things, and this is how you'll identify them. So the significance the Imam is pointing to is that ziyarat of Arba'in of Imam Hussain is one of those physical attributes. By seeing someone participate in it, you know they're one of our Shia, they're one of our followers of Ahlul Bayt. When you look at the commemoration of the events of Karbala, the recommendation is commemorate Ashura in your towns, so that wherever you are in the world, people that live around you learn about the significance of the events of Karbala and the significance of the day of Ashura. In comparison to that, Arba'in is that tradition of going to Imam Hussain. That the fundamental of Arba'in is when did the Ahlul Bayt, when did the Haram reach Karbala and do the ziyarat of Imam Hussain? And it was noted that this was 40 days after the event of Ashura. Now there's some debate and some discussion historically. Was it 1 year and 40 days after Karbala or exactly 40 days after Karbala? Semantics. There's no correct answer that I have for you. It has been researched both ways and both have valid points within it. The significance is that the 20th of Safar is the day upon which it is narrated that the first visitor to the Imam's grave was Jabir, and that after him, the Haram of Imam Hussain came back to the land of Karbala. So for us, the Arba'in of Imam Hussain is to give us an opportunity that if we are expanding the message of Imam Hussain in one direction, that we are commemorating and visiting Imam Hussain in another direction. That we are attached to that grave as well too, and not to be separated from it. And that it is important to visit the grave. So the event of Arba'in, the other Ahlul Bayt, their message doesn't have this attached to them. It doesn't mean that they are less significant. It means that a flag was needed to be raised amongst the Ahlul Bayt, and this is the flag. That there's no separation. Once you become a follower of the Ithna Ashari, of the 12, we all go to the same place, we all go at the same time. Which is why this year you can take a look and see that over 22 million participated in the event of Arba'in as the official number has been released. 22 million people. If we were given the freedom that it's the Arba'in of this person, that person, so on and so forth, where would you see a collection of the Madhab Jaffari in one location in this number? So the idea was to collect, to bring us together, to give us the opportunity to connect and to stay attached to this message and ensure that the importance of this message doesn't die out. That's why the Arba'in of Imam Hussain is commemorated, though it may not be commemorated for anyone else. So even for us, when our marhumin pass, we too have established a tradition of the 40th. The tradition of the 40th is what? Is that after so many days, it may happen that I have forgotten to include for my marhum the a'mal on a daily basis. That by using this as a reminder, I recollect and I bring people back together and I send thawab and ajr to my marhum and I make sure that their message stays alive, that we continue to remember them. Invite the community to participate. There's nothing wrong with this tradition. It's a good tradition. But its fundamental is to keep us and make sure that the message of Imam Hussain stays alive. And that's exactly what we're here to do. Which brings us to our final question. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. What is the benefit of going to the grave of Imam Hussain? What is the benefit of going to any grave? Let's make this personal before we make this a big discussion. Let's say my grandmother who passed away in June, she passed away in Pakistan, and she did, unfortunately. If I recite Fatiha for her, does it reach her? And this is a fair question. Am I going to the grave because otherwise if I don't go to the grave, I can't do any good for that deceased? Now, I'll answer the question myself, don't worry. No. Someone asked our sixth Imam this question, and the Imam explained that the awareness of the spirit is different than the awareness of the body. For a living human being to hear someone, you have to be within a particular range or have a particular way of communicating with them, otherwise they can't hear you and they can't reach you. The Imam explains that the awareness of the soul is very different than the awareness of the human being. The awareness of the soul is as if you can take this object, and when I was alive, maybe I could only see this much. But the soul's awareness is that it can be aware of the entire earth and everyone who's on it simultaneously. So wherever you happen to be in this world, if you have a marhum anywhere in the world, if you recite Fatiha for them, they are aware that you are reciting Fatiha for them. They are connected to you because of the nature of how the spirit's awareness is different than the awareness of a human body. So same thing, our spirit is very much more functional, has much more ability and much more senses than our body does, and our body is the restriction of the soul. Now, which is why, and this is an aside, if you guys are okay, we're going to take 2 minutes, I'm going to explain something really cool. You guys all right? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sallu ala Muhammad. Remember there's that hadith that says that for the mu'min, death is like taking off your prison cells and putting on clean clothes and finding freedom. And death for a disbeliever is like putting on chains and being imprisoned. You guys have heard this before? There's a hadith that tells us this, that for the believer, death is freedom from a cage. And for the disbeliever, death is the idea of being imprisoned. The significance of this is the development of the soul. A disbeliever never develops his soul. So now when the soul becomes separated from the body, it's weak. It's like an atrophied muscle. It's like a muscle that doesn't work. Because they never did any work on it. They never built it. They never invested in it. They never took it to the gym and worked it out. They only counted on their body. And now that the body's not there to support the soul is malnourished. And now the experience in their afterlife is very painful because their soul has no nourishment that it could only collect when it was a human being. And it collected it through ibadat of Allah. On the other hand, a mu'min is someone who spent his time in ibadat, who preferred actions to do for the sake of Allah that had no material benefit and only a spiritual benefit. And the consequence of that was that his soul was strengthened so much that when he died, his soul was being limited by the body, and now the limiter had been removed and he was free. This is the same concept that when we talk about a mu'min's soul is something that is freed by the moment of death, that it's a relief from the difficulties of this life. And at that point in time, their awareness is increased. Now, if that's the example of a normal soul, what do you think the soul of Imam Hussain is like? That we need to go to Imam Hussain, otherwise Imam Hussain won't know us, he won't recognize us? Allah describes the souls of the shuhada. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Allah says if you're a shaheed, never count a shaheed or one who is killed in the way of Allah as dead. Rather, they are alive and they receive their sustenance directly from Allah. So Imam Hussain doesn't need us to go to his grave. That's not why we go to ziyarat, because the Imam won't be able to recognize us if we don't go to his grave. If you sit here and call to the Imam knows you fardan farda, that every single one of you, the Imam knows you. And this is important to understand. The Imam knows us in such a way that the Imam, inshallah, will do shafa'ah for us on the Day of Judgment. What does that mean? That the Imam will ask Allah to send us to heaven. When I serve the cause of Imam Hussain, am I tricking the Imam? That, I'm going to get in under his shafa and he won't notice? No. When you have an opportunity to serve the cause of Imam Hussain, it is by the permission of Imam Hussain that you get that opportunity. Because if he's going to intercede for me on the Day of Judgment, he has to know who I am. He has to agree to intercede for me before I can get in his line. Never look at the opportunity that, oh, I have the opportunity to recite Marsiya or Noha or Fatiha in a majlis, or to share something in a majlis as a responsibility, or to even serve the people who come to the majlis as a responsibility or a bad thing. It's an opportunity that the imam is putting a contract in front of you that says, come to me, be one of my people, I will intercede for you. If we look at it in material terms, it's like, oh great, I have to do all of the work now. But if you understand the reality of the status of the imam, that he has the right to intercede for anyone, the opportunity to work for the imam and to serve the zawar, to serve the visitors of the majlis, to serve those who come to commemorate the imam, it's by his permission. It's not an accident. So if the imam's awareness is so great, and the imam is aware of each of us, and he knows each of us, then why do I need to go to a ziyarah? To answer this, the hadith again comes from Imam Hussain al-Askari alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. See, in the life of Imam Hussain al-Askari, his imamat was very short, but it was filled with spies. And this hadith either points to his father or to Imam al-Askari. So either Imam al-Hadi or Imam al-Askari, who were both in the city of Samarra, surrounded by spies. And the discussion of why is it's a very good discussion, but it's not, we don't have the time for it. Imam gets sick. He says to his companions, which one of you will go from me to Karbala to pray for me? Now amongst these companions was a spy. When they got together and they said, who can go from Samarra safely under these spies and everything and go to Karbala and make dua for the health of the imam? This spy poked up his head and he says, wait a minute. Isn't Imam Hussain al-Askari an imam? I said, yeah. And Imam Hussain is an imam? Yeah. So why does Imam Hussain need to go to Imam Hussain to pray to Allah? And people got confused. They got so confused, they went back to Imam Hussain al-Askari. And I said, Ya Rasulullah, you're an imam, he's an imam. Why do we have to go to an imam to pray for an imam? And Imam Hussain al-Askari exposes it and he says, the one who asked this question is a spy. But I'll tell you the answer. It's not because I am more holy or Imam Hussain is more holy. It's because on this earth there are certain places where Allah likes to be called, and when you call him there, he answers your dua more quickly. My asking you to go to Karbala for me is not because I cannot communicate with Allah, but rather Allah loves to be called from the land of Karbala. So go to Karbala and make dua for me. The significance is not that the imam cannot be connected to us wherever we are and that the imam needs us to go to Karbala. No, I have needs and desires that to fulfill them, I need the wasila of the land of Karbala that belongs to the imam and the grave in Karbala that belongs to the imam. Our 12th imam explains this in Ziyarat al-Nahiyah, which is one of the authentic ziyarats of what happened in Karbala and salam to Imam Hussain, that is actually written by the 12th Imam. Imam Zaman explains, he says, "O Aba Abdullah, for your sacrifice, Allah has given you 3 things He has not given to anyone else. He has given shifa in your turba. Today, khaki shifa, understand something, we're made of clay. To eat clay is haram for you. Imam Sadiq would say, if you ate dirt and died because of it, I wouldn't read your namaz mayyit. Meaning it's haram to eat clay because we're made of clay. But the exception to that is the clay from the grave of Imam Hussain is not only permissible to eat, but it cures your sicknesses and diseases by eating it. That doesn't mean take spoonfuls like cereal. You take a little dot like this and you can mix it with water about the size of a lentil, and you mix it with water, and to consume that will cure your diseases, cure your sicknesses, solve your problems. The Imam continues, he says, the second thing that Allah has given you is that He has given all of the other Imams are from your children, Imam Hussain. That Allah placed all the rest of the Imams from the children of Imam Hussain because of the azamat and greatness of his sacrifice. And then he goes further, he says, the third thing that Allah gave you, Imam Hussain, for the greatness of your greatness of your sacrifice is istijabat dua tahta qubbatihi. That under your dome, Imam Hussain, whatever somebody asks for, Allah fulfills and gives you what you want. When we go to Karbala, it's for our selfish reasons, that we need to be there, that every step that you take to Imam Hussain is rewarded with Allah. So therefore, I want that reward from Allah, so I go to Imam Hussain. I want the answer to my dua, so I go to Imam Hussain. I want to separate from my difficulties and my bala, so I go to Imam Hussain. All of these ziyarat that we go to of Ahlul Bayt is not because they can't recognize us if we don't go there. It's because we need that purification and connection with our soul that comes through the aspect of going to them. Why is it that a person who goes to ziyarat once wants to go again? Because you wake up when you're there. You feel connected when you're there. You feel a purpose in your life when you're there. We are the ones who are in need of this ziyarat, not them. It may happen that by circumstance we may never have the opportunity. There are those people who, for example, don't have a correct passport, who are refugees, who have other issues. So what, that means that they're not entitled to heaven? They're not entitled to the shafa of the imam because they couldn't go? What if they were in the times where it was unsafe to go and they couldn't go? No. The shafa of the imam is something. The ziyarat of the imam is something else. The ziyarat of the imam is for me. If I have the tawfiq and the ability to go, I shouldn't ignore it. And this is why when the haram of Rasulullah, when Sayyidah Zainab and Imam Zainul Abidin were on their way back from Sham, the Salar said to them, he says, there are two paths I can take you by. One will take you directly to Medina. The other will take you through the land of Karbala. Which do you prefer? Sayyidah Zainab told her nephew, take us to Karbala. Take us to go see my brother. I have not seen him in so long. Remember something, Sayyidah Zainab was that sister who they described from the moment she was born was never separated from Imam Hussain. In the biography of Sayyidah Zainab is a statement that is very powerful that they describe, and they say that when she was an infant and she would cry, that all they had to do was put her in the hands of Imam Hussain and she would become silent. Any grief and difficulty this sister had could be removed from her by being in the company of Imam Hussain. Which is why even when she got married, she put a condition in her marital contract that should my brother Hussain ever travel, that I, Zainab, will go with my brother. I will never be separated from him. Until it was that 11th of Muharram, that for the first time Sayyidah Zainab was not with her brother. And to torture this lady, they put her on the back of a camel and then paraded the women past the bodies of the shuhada. As they did this, they described that Sayyidah Zainab threw herself from the camel, went to the body of her brother Imam Hussain on the 11th of Muharram. And she said, brother, I am bidding you farewell. Zainab has never been separated from you. But oh brother, there is a tradition that when a sister bids farewell to her brother, she kisses his cheeks. Brother Hussain, you have no cheeks for me to kiss today when I bid you farewell. Oh brother, I will bid farewell to you in a way that not our mother Zahra ever did, not our grandfather ever did, not our father ever did. Brother, I will bid farewell to you that only in a way that I, Zainab, can bid farewell to Hussain. Sayyidah Zainab, leaving the field of Karbala, kissed the cut throat of her brother Hussain. She kissed his cut throat and rejoined this qafila and went through the difficulties of Kufa and Sham. In Sham, she did not even acknowledge her children over the grief of her brother Hussain. Now when they are returning to Medina and they ask, would you want to go to Karbala? Sayyidah Zainab says, take me to my brother. I have never been away from him for so long. This is the day of Arba'een, in which Jabir comes from Medina to visit the grave of Imam Hussain. Jabir is that one who narrates to us Hadith Kisa. He has been attached to and in love with and caring for Ahlul Bayt since Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain were in the lap of Rasulullah. Now Jabir has heard of the murder of Imam Hussain, and he comes as an old blind man with his servant Atiyah with him. He comes to the land of Karbala. As they come and they are close to it, he says, Atiyah, take me to Furat. He does his ghusl in the river of Furat. And now he says, Atiyah, take me to the grave of Hussain. They describe that this old man, on approaching the grave of Imam Hussain, would walk and fall until eventually he started crawling like a child towards the direction of the grave of Imam Hussain. When they come close, his servant Atiyah, because Jabir is blind, he says, Jabir, I cannot tell. There is no marker on which of these graves is the grave of your beloved Hussain. Jabir says, I will call to him. He says, I will call to him. Jabir in his blindness calls out, Hussain, Hussain, where are you? Hussain. And then he calls out, he says, why does the beloved not answer when I call him? Why does the one who I love more dearly does not answer me? Then he answers his own question. Oh my madloom, they cut your neck and took your head, is why you do not answer me. They said Jabir found the grave of Abu Abdullah by the scent of Jannah that came from this grave, that he crawled upon, lay upon this grave, knowing it was the grave of Imam Hussain, and would come and go from consciousness. As he sat there weeping over the shahadat of Imam Hussain, Atiyah calls out and he says, oh Jabir, I see a kafila with black flags proceeding in this direction. Jabir says, oh Atiyah, can you determine who they are? He says, I cannot tell if these are the soldiers of Ubaydullah or one of our people. Jabir says, oh Atiyah, go and discover. And if it happens to me that my master Imam Zainul Abidin is coming back, oh Atiyah, for the sake of Allah, I shall free you. Atiyah rushes towards this caravan that is coming. And when he returns, he comes back and he says, oh Jabir, it is your Imam who has come. Jabir stands in the honor to greet Imam Zainul Abidin. He proceeds towards the Imam. Imam Zainul Abidin proceeds toward Jabir. The two greet in such a way that it is as if the first person to console Imam Zainul Abidin for the murder of his family is none other than Jabir. Imam Zainul Abidin begins to complain of the condition. He says, oh Jabir, here is where our brothers were killed. Here is where our companions were killed. Here is where they slayed my father. Here is where our tents were. Jabir, they killed our children when they left from the tents. Jabir, Imam Zainul Abidin took all of the pain in his heart and began to express and show the places in Karbala that here it was that my father went to collect my brother as Akbar. Here it is where my brother Asghar flapped like a bird in the arms of my father. Here it is where my cousin Qasim was trampled by horses. At one point he says, oh Jabir, let us leave this place. Jabir says, did I do something? He says, no, but look, the way I am crying to you about these places, my mother and my aunts and my sisters want to have this time too. They want this opportunity. Imam Zainul Abidin moves Jabir away. We saw on 11th Muharram Sayyidah Zainab threw herself from the camel when the oppressor was present. How did Sayyidah Zainab return to her brother today? She came to the grave of that brother as all of the ladies asked, where is my son? Where is my brother? There is one grave there that Sayyidah Zainab sits upon and complains, brother, I fulfilled your wasiyah as you commanded. They never saw me cry in front of them. I never raised my hands in but dua. I never cursed them. But brother, there was a wasiyah that you left in my trust. There was a child that you gave in my care. Brother, I have come back without that child. No matter how I would try, she would cry and they would strike your daughter until eventually they killed her in oppression. A child of 4 years does not die the way Sakina was killed. It was oppression and abuse that killed her. If she was to sit and say that, Zainab would complain, brother, the women refused to give ghusl to your daughter. Why? They said there is a disease in her skin. Zainul Abidin called to them and said, this is not a disease. My sister was burned on the day of Ashura. No one bandaged her wounds. Her clothing grew into her skin. There is nothing wrong with my sister. Sayyidah Zainab may say, I tried to complete that ghusl myself, but oh brother, as I took off her clothing, her skin would come with it. I cried to Zainul Abidin, Oh Sajjad, what do I do? He said, Oh aunt, bury my sister like this. Oh Hussain, I left your daughter alone. Today is the day that Sayyidah Zainab would complain. She would sit by this grave, announce all of the tribulations, all of the abuse, but at one moment, she would turn and she would say, Oh Sajjad, I never saw my Abbas again. Oh Sajjad, where is my Abbas now? Imam Zainul Abidin would say, Oh aunt, I have made his grave by the river of Furat, where he insisted, do not move my body from. That Abbas who would come at your first call, say that Zainab would turn, Oh Abbas, Zainab calls, you do not come. Brother, don't worry, I will come to you. What did that Zainab do? When she sat by the grave of this Abbas and began to complain, Oh brother, you were the protector of my hijab, but where were you when they took my hijab? There is a description that says, the night of Sham Ghariba, there is one hijab that was taken from a woman who was the color of red, her hijab. When they asked in history which of the women would have a red hijab on this day, one of the poets narrates and he says this was the hijab of Zainab that was red. When they would ask and say that did she not know better? Did she not know that this is an inappropriate thing? The answer would come, no, you don't understand. The hijab when the day of Ashura began was white. But when they brought the body of Akbar in front of her, Zainab threw herself on her grown son's body. She cried until that hijab had turned red. Abbas was not there to witness. Abbas, how they took that hijab from me. Abbas, how they took me through the bazaar. How we called you in the markets. Brother, how will you explain to Amir al-Mu'mineen, our father? I was left in your care, but you did not come. But your sister comes to you. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره. With tears in our eyes, we raise our hands in dua. 10 times we call out, ندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم يا الله 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 يا محمود بحق محمد يا أعلى بحق علي يا فاطر السماوات بحق فاطمة يا محسن بحق الحسن يا قديم الأحسان بحق الحسين. Oh Allah, accept this small ibadat from us. Ya Allah, give the thawab of this majlis to our marhumeen and all those who are in need of dua. Ya Allah, we have gathered here with hajat by the right of Aba Abdullah, by the right of Bab al-Hawa'ij, Abul Fadl al-Abbas, by the right of all of the Ahlul Bayt. Fulfill our hajat. Ya Allah, there are those amongst our families, our community, the mu'mineen who are suffering through sickness and disease. Ya Allah, give shafa'at to the mu'mineen wherever they are. Oh Allah, keep our children on the upright path of Ahlul Bayt. Hasten the reappearance of Sahibul Zaman. Make us and our families from the upright supporters of Sahibul Zaman. And entitle us to the ziyarat of Imam Hussain in this world and the shafa of Imam al-Hussain in akhirah. One surah Fatiha for all of our marhumeen with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. مات يا حسين.
गिर पड़ा घोड़े से जबरन में शह कर वो बला, सारे आलम में कयामत खाता एक शोरे बाबा। दर्द में डूबी हुई आई ये एक माँ की सदा, हाय मजलूम हुसैन मेरा मजलूम हुसैन, हाय मजलूम हुसैन। असरे आशूर मेरा लाल बड़ा प्यासा है, हाय मजलूम हुसैन मेरा मजलूम हुसैन, मेरा मजलूम हुसैन। ये मोहम्मद का नवासा है अली का बेटा, क्या खता है मेरे बेटे की बताओ तो ज़रा, जालिमों क्यों इससे बेजुर्मो खता गैरा है, हाय मजलूम हुसैन मेरा मजलूम हुसैन, मेरा मजलूम हुसैन। हाय तन्हाई का आलम के कोई पास नहीं, हाय कासिम नहीं अकबर नहीं अब्बास नहीं, या अलिया ओ मेरा लाल बड़ा तन्हा है, हाय मजलूम हुसैन मेरा मजलूम हुसैन, मेरा मजलूम हुसैन। या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन पर मोहम्मद वाली मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु।
अस्सलामु अलैका या रसूलल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या अली अल-मुर्तज़ा, अस्सलामु अलैकी या फ़ातिमतुज़ ज़हरा, अस्सलामु अलैका या हसन मुज्तबा, अस्सलामु अलैका या अबा अब्दुल्लाह व अलल अरवाह अल्लती हल्लत बिफ़नाइक, अलैका मिन्नी सलामुल्लाहि अबदन मा बक़ीत व बक़ियल लैल वन नहार वला जहलुल्लाह अल आखिरतल अहदी मिन्नी लिज़ियारतिकुम। अस्सलामु अलल हुसैन व अला अली इब्न अल हुसैन व अला औलादिल हुसैन व अला अस्हाबिल हुसैन, खुसूसन सैयदी व मौलाय अबुल फ़ज़्ल अब्बास, अब्बास इब्न अमीर अल-मुअमिनीन व क़ासिम इब्न अल हसन व मुस्लिम इब्न अक़ील व हानी इब्न उरवा व हबीब इब्न मज़ाहिर व हूर शहीद अर्रियाही। अस्सलामु अलैकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। अस्सलामु अलैका या मौला व इब्न मौला, अस्सलामु अलैका या गरीब अल-गुरबा, अस्सलामु अलैका या शम्स अस-समूस या अनीस अन-नफूस या अली इब्न मूसा रज़ा व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। अस्सलामु अलैका या मौलाना साहिब अल-अस्र वज़्ज़मान, अल-अमान अल-अमान अल-अमान। अस्सलामु अलैका या खलीफत ar-रहमान, अस्सलामु अलैका या शरीक अल-कुरान, अस्सलामु अलैका या इमाम अल-इंस वल जान। अज्जलल्लाहु तआला फरजक व सहलल्लाहु तआला मखरजक व जअलना मिन आवानिक व अंसारिक व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। अल्लाहुम्मा